Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
The old woman sat in the park night after night. The police chief kneeled when he found out why. On a cold, quiet night in Ridgewood Park, the dim streetlights cast a faint glow along the path, just enough to reveal the silhouette of a woman sitting alone on an old bench. Rosa, with her silver hair and frail figure, wore a worn gray wool coat, sitting there as still as a statue. Her eyes were deep and sorrowful, as though lost in a faraway world. Rosa had been there, every night, for the past 20 years. Louis, the town's police chief, was the only one who noticed her. He had grown so accustomed to this sight that he didn't need to look closely to know who it was. But tonight, as Louis stepped out of his patrol car and approached Rosa, he felt something different. "Mrs. Rosa," Louis spoke, his tone calm but firm. "It's late, the park is closed, you can't stay here all night." Rosa looked up, her eyes brightened briefly when she saw Louis, but they quickly dimmed again. "I'm waiting for my son," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Charles will come looking for me, as he promised." Louis sighed. He had heard this countless times. He also knew that Charles, Rosa's son, had been sentenced 20 years ago for robbing a store. It was a dark, mysterious case, riddled with controversy, yet long forgotten. Louis felt sorry for Rosa, but he knew she was clinging to a fragile hope. "Mrs. Rosa, you say that every night," Louis said gently. "But you know, it's been 20 years. Charles is innocent." Rosa interrupted, her voice suddenly rising as if a long-suppressed cry of pain had escaped. "Louis, don't you understand? My son didn't do it. He was framed, deceived." Louis frowned slightly. He'd heard these words many times, but they never felt familiar enough to ignore. There was something in Rosa's voice, as though she had lived with this truth every second, every minute, for the past 20 years. Then why did no one stand up for him at the time? Louis asked, half curious, half testing Rosa's patience. Rosa fell silent, her gaze fixed on the distance, as if searching for a memory lost in the flow of time. "Because everyone was afraid," she said, her voice fading. "Afraid of Manny and his influence." The name Manny. Louis shuddered at the mention of it. A powerful smuggling kingpin in Ridgewood back in those days, someone everyone wanted to avoid. All the rumors about him, about how he controlled everything from behind the scenes, made Louis feel uneasy. But he had never thought that Manny might have had anything to do with Charles's case. Rosa noticed the change in Louis's expression and continued. "I tried to do everything I could. But who would believe me? An old woman, weak, powerless." Louis couldn't find the words to respond. He knew justice wasn't always perfect, but could it be possible that Charles's case was connected to a larger, darker force like this? Louis felt a strong urge to dig deeper, yet he also knew he would face challenges. Even as the police chief, he wasn't sure he could do anything when his colleagues continued to dismiss Rosa, seeing her as nothing more than a madwoman. A man in a brown coat approached from a distance, walking slowly but with purpose. It was Ray, one of the park guards, who was also familiar with Rosa's nightly visits. "Louis, I think it's time we put an end to this," Ray said in a cold tone. "If she doesn't leave, I'll have to call someone to remove her." "No need, Ray," Louis interrupted, still looking at Rosa. "Let me talk to her a bit more." "But rules are rules, Louis," Ray insisted. "We can't let someone stay here overnight. Do you know what it feels like to wait, Ray?" Rosa suddenly spoke, her voice soft yet filled with pain. "I've sat here, in this cold, in this darkness, because I believe that Charles will come back. He promised, and I believe in my son." Louis felt his heart sink, partly because of Rosa's determination, but also because he knew that her words would not sway people like Ray. Ray shook his head and was about to walk away when another police car pulled up nearby. Tessa, a female officer, stepped out. "Chief Louis, is everything okay?" she asked, glancing at Ray and Rosa. Same as always, Tessa, Louis replied, smiling slightly but unable to hide his exhaustion. Tessa looked at Rosa. She recalled passing her many times on patrol, seeing her in that same spot. "Are you okay, Mrs. Rosa?" Tessa asked, her voice gentle. "Do you believe in waiting, Tessa?" Rosa asked in return, her gaze no longer on those around her but fixed on something far beyond, something invisible. Some things are worth waiting a lifetime for, even if it's just a glimmer of hope. Tessa didn't respond, but Louis knew she felt the same as he did, a mixture of pity and helplessness. "All right, Mrs. Rosa," Louis sighed, finally deciding. "Tonight, you can stay a little longer. But just tonight." Rosa gave a faint smile. "Thank you, Louis. I promise I'll leave when the sun rises. But I have to be here, to wait for Charles." The pale moonlight cast a cold glow over the park, and none of them knew that the truth Rosa was clinging to was far more complex and dark than they could imagine. The next night, Rosa returned to Ridgewood Park. This time, she carried an old, worn black umbrella, as tattered as her memories. Rain drizzled down, cold droplets landing on the leaves and mingling with the eerie sound of the wind. Louis sat in his patrol car, watching that familiar figure through the misty glass. He sighed, wondering if this scene would ever end. Stepping out of the car, Louis shivered as the cold seeped through his coat. His footsteps were soft, blending with the sounds of the night. "Mrs. Rosa, it's so cold and rainy tonight, yet you're still here?" Louis said, his tone a mix of reproach and concern. "Mr. Louis, I can't give up," Rosa replied, her eyes fixed on the distance. "Charles will come back, I know it. I have to be here, to welcome him home." Louis didn't know what more to say, just stood there, his eyes searching her face, trying to detect any hint of deception. But all he saw was deep sadness. Suddenly, there was the sound of footsteps approaching. A tall, thin man in a black raincoat, holding a paper bag, came closer. Louis squinted, recognizing Gabriel, the manager of a convenience store on the corner. "Good evening, Rosa. I brought some bread for you," Gabriel said, placing the paper bag beside her. "I thought you might be hungry." "Thank you, Gabriel," Rosa replied with a gentle smile, though it quickly faded. "You're very kind. But all I need is for Charles to come home." Gabriel turned to Louis, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and confusion. "Do you believe her, Louis?" Gabriel asked softly. "I don't know anymore, Gabriel," Louis replied, his gaze still fixed on Rosa. "But I do know she won't stop waiting." Gabriel shook his head, seeming as if he wanted to say something more but held back. "I've lived here almost my whole life, I knew Charles. He wasn't a thief," Gabriel said after a moment of silence. "It's just, life isn't always fair." "That's right, it's unfair," Rosa said, as if responding to her own thoughts, her eyes filled with unwavering determination. "But I'll never stop believing the truth will come to light." Louis looked at Gabriel, as though hoping to find answers in his eyes, but Gabriel merely shrugged, turning to walk away into the rain, leaving Louis and Rosa in the cold silence. A sound echoed from afar, startling all three of them. Louis turned sharply, hand on his gun, his eyes alert. Out of the darkness emerged a young woman with long black hair, her face partly hidden beneath a red hood. "Hello, Rosa," she said, her voice gentle but with a strange tone. "Are you still waiting here every night?" Rosa looked up, slightly surprised, then recognized her. It was Lucy, Gabriel's niece, who often worked part-time at his store. "Lucy? Why are you here at this hour?" "I was just worried about you," Lucy replied, stepping closer, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Have you ever thought that, maybe Charles won't be able to come back?" "No, Lucy. Charles will come back," Rosa said firmly, her voice stronger than ever. "He promised, and I know my son. I know he didn't do it." Lucy lowered her gaze, her eyes avoiding Rosa's. But it's been 20 years, Mrs. Rosa. Sensing the tension, Louis interjected gently. Lucy, sometimes there are things we don't fully understand. Maybe Charles has a reason for not returning sooner. Lucy turned to Louis, a hint of doubt in her eyes. Then why didn't anyone look into what really happened? Why did everyone just accept Charles as a thief and let it be? Louis fell silent. Lucy's question unsettled him. Indeed, no one had wanted to reopen the case over the past 2 decades, as if it had been buried under the dust of time, along with Rosa's hopes and faith. At that moment, another man appeared from a distance, holding an old newspaper. It was George, a retired local journalist. He walked over, his eyes deep and shadowed as if he had seen too many dark things. Louis, I heard you're interested in Charles's case, George said, his voice low and drawn out. Is that true? Louis nodded slightly. I'm not sure, George. I just feel there's too much wrong with this story. Then you should know that Manny still has many things in his grip, George whispered, his eyes darting around as if fearing someone might overhear. And what happened to Charles wasn't just a mistake. Louis felt a chill run down his spine, as if an invisible shadow had enveloped him. George, what do you mean? Explain yourself. This isn't the place to talk, George said, his voice suddenly urgent. Meet me tomorrow night at the cafe down on Pine Street. There are things you need to know, and they won't be easy to hear. Louis watched as George disappeared into the darkness, feeling like a mist had risen within his mind. Tonight, everything seemed to sink into a thick, ominous, and more confusing darkness than ever before. Rosa's story was not just the pain of a mother who lost her son, but a piece of a much larger puzzle, and he feared that when that puzzle was complete, it would reveal something no one wanted to see. Rosa remained there, under the cold rain, her gaze distant as she mumbled. Charles, I know you didn't do it. I'll wait for you, no matter how long it takes. That night, Louis went to the cafe at the end of Pine Street as promised to meet George. The light inside was dim, and only a few patrons were quietly sipping their coffee, the soft clinking of spoons echoing as if to drown out any other sounds. George sat in the far corner, head lowered over a cup of black coffee, the rising steam obscuring part of his wrinkled, worn face. Louis approached, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. I'm here. Now tell me, George, Louis began, his voice calm but unable to hide his tension. George looked up, his eyes weary yet sharp, as if trying to pierce through Louis's mind. Louis, are you sure you want to hear this? Some things, the more you know, the more trouble they cause. The more I know, the better, Louis responded without hesitation. I want to get to the bottom of Charles's case, and if you have information, I need to hear it. George chuckled softly, but it was a twisted, grim smile. Very well. But don't say I didn't warn you. He took a deep breath and began. Charles's case, from the beginning, it was never simple. Manny had his hands in everything. He had bribed certain police officers, prosecutors, even the judge. The trial was just a show to cover up what really happened. Louis sat motionless, unsure how to react. Bribes? Are you certain? George shrugged, his gaze drifting to the window as if he wished to escape those dark memories. As sure as day and night. But no one wanted to touch Manny, he was too powerful. He knew how to make people stay silent, either with money, with threats, or both. Louis felt his heartbeat quicken, anger rising within him. Then why are you telling me this? If everyone was afraid, why are you different? George looked Louis straight in the eye, his gaze filled with bitterness. Because I was once afraid too. But the more I stayed silent, the more I felt like I was an accomplice. Rosa doesn't deserve this, and neither does Charles. If you're willing to pursue this, I'll help, but be ready to face the worst. Louis felt the cafe's atmosphere grow stifling. Just then, the door swung open, a cold wind blowing in along with a man in a heavy coat and hat. He walked to the counter, but his eyes discreetly glanced toward Louis and George's table. George noticed and suddenly paled. "We have to leave," George said urgently, his eyes darting toward the door. "We're being watched." "What do you mean?" Louis asked, confused. "I've said too much," George replied, his voice trembling. "Tonight isn't safe anymore. I'll contact you later." With that, George stood up and quickly left the cafe, leaving Louis alone with a flood of questions. Louis turned to look at the stranger, who was pretending to study the menu but couldn't hide his intense, probing gaze. Louis realized he needed to be cautious, but he wasn't about to give up. He knew Rosa deserved answers, and if Charles was innocent, he had to uncover the truth. The next morning, Louis stopped by Rosa's house. The small home sat at the end of the street, with closed windows and walls whose paint had faded and peeled. He knocked, but there was no answer. Just as he was about to leave, the door opened, and Lucy appeared, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "Lucy? What are you doing here?" Louis asked, surprised. "Mrs. Rosa came down with a high fever last night," Lucy said softly, her voice laced with worry. "I came to take care of her. I don't think she'll survive this winter." Louis felt a pang in his heart at her words. He stepped inside, looking around. The house was tidy but bare, devoid of life except for a few old photographs on the wall, one of which was of Charles when he was young. Rosa lay on the bed, eyes closed, her face thin and pale. "Mrs. Rosa, it's me, Louis," he said gently. "Are you all right?" Rosa slowly opened her eyes, weary and unfocused. "Louis. Charles, has he come back yet?" she asked, her voice weak but still filled with hope. Louis sat beside her, taking her hand. "Don't worry. I'll find the truth. I promise." Rosa held his hand tightly, her eyes lighting up with a hint of hope. "Thank you. But don't let them hurt you. Manny, he won't let this go." Louis flinched, surprised that Rosa mentioned Manny's name. "You know Manny?" Rosa nodded slowly. "He came to see me after Charles was arrested. He told me not to try to prove his innocence, that no one would believe me anyway. And if I did try, Charles would never see the light of day again." Louis froze, feeling a surge of anger rise within him. "He threatened you?" "Yes, but I wasn't afraid," Rosa said, her voice breaking as tears filled her eyes. "I had already lost everything. I just want my son back, even if it's only one last time." Louis felt a lump in his throat, unsure of what to say. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless in the face of someone's suffering. He stood up and turned to Lucy, who was wiping her own tears beside him. "Please take care of Mrs. Rosa." "I'll be back soon," Louis said, looking at Lucy with a gaze that promised his commitment. "What are you planning to do?" Lucy asked, her voice laced with worry. "He won't let you get away with this." Louis let out a faint, cold smile. "I've already taken the first step. There's no turning back now. If they try to stop me, they'll see I won't back down easily." Lucy watched as Louis walked away, torn between a desire to trust him and a deep fear. No one in town had ever dared to stand up to Manny, and she knew Louis was facing a dangerous battle. But that night, despite her illness, Rosa went to sit on her usual bench in Ridgewood Park. She ignored everyone's advice, her eyes fixed on the distance, where no one appeared. She continued to wait, even as the cold rain soaked her coat, unable to stop waiting no matter how harsh the truth was. Louis returned to the police station early the next morning, his mind burdened by everything George had revealed. He sat in his office, staring at Charles's case file on his desk, feeling like everything was getting more complicated than ever. Louis knew he had to act, but he also understood that people like Manny wouldn't go down easily. A soft knock sounded on his door, and then Tessa, the young officer Lewis trusted, entered. "Chief, is everything okay? You seem exhausted these past few days," she asked, her voice filled with concern. Lewis looked at Tessa, considering for a moment. "Tessa, I need your help with something. But you must keep it to yourself. Don't tell anyone." Tessa frowned slightly but nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, Chief. I'm ready to help." Lewis opened a drawer and took out an old, worn file, its cover yellowed with age. "This is the case file for Charles, Mrs. Rosa's son. He was accused of robbing a store and sentenced 20 years ago. But I believe something isn't right. I need you to review everything, look for inconsistencies, anything that could help us reopen the case." Tessa looked at him in surprise. She hadn't expected Lewis to entrust her with something like this. "But Chief, this case has been closed for so long. If we dig it up, it won't make a lot of people happy." "I know," Lewis replied, his voice calm but resolute. "But if someone's innocent, we have to do something. Tessa, I need you to trust me, at least this once." Tessa looked at him for a long moment before finally nodding. "I'll do it. But if anything goes wrong, I hope you'll protect me." Lewis smiled. "Thank you, Tessa. I promise." Tessa took the file and left the office, leaving Lewis alone with his troubled thoughts. He knew that investigating the case would pit him against powerful forces, but he couldn't stop. Rosa's story and her unwavering resolve had compelled him to act. That evening, Lewis returned to Ridgewood Park, not for his patrol, but to meet with George as they had arranged. He walked slowly through the deserted pathways, the streetlights casting long, shadowy figures. When he reached the bench where Rosa always sat each night, he saw her dozing off, her head tilted to one side, a wool scarf tightly wrapped around her neck. Lewis approached and gently nudged her awake. "Mrs. Rosa, why don't you go home and rest? It's so cold out here." Rosa opened her eyes and, seeing Lewis, she smiled faintly, though it was still tinged with sadness and weariness. "I can't go home, Lewis. I'm afraid that if I'm not here, Charles won't know where to find me." Lewis sat down beside her, feeling the cold seep through his coat. "I'm investigating Charles's case," he said softly, afraid that speaking too loudly would make his words vanish into the night air. "I'm going to do everything I can to find the truth, Mrs. Rosa." Rosa looked at Lewis, her eyes suddenly lighting up like a lamp in the darkness. "Thank you, Lewis. I always believed that if someone just listened, my son would be cleared." Lewis didn't reply, he simply held her hand tightly, as if to give her strength, and perhaps himself as well. Just then, a deep voice sounded from behind them. "A touching story, Lewis. But you're playing a dangerous game." Lewis turned and saw it was Raymond, a private investigator who had once worked for people like Manny. "Raymond, what are you doing here?" Lewis asked, surprised and cautious. Raymond stepped closer, a half-smile on his face. "I heard you're digging up Charles's case." "Not a good idea, Lewis. Some things are better left in the past." Lewis stood up, facing Raymond. "If Charles is innocent, I'll do whatever it takes to clear his name. No matter who I have to face." Raymond sneered. "Lewis, you're naive. Manny has arranged everything meticulously. Do you really think you can take him down?" "We'll see about that," Lewis replied, his voice low but resolute. "But I can't turn my back when I know someone might be innocent." Raymond looked at Lewis, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "I've warned you, Lewis. Don't let your sense of justice lead to disaster. Manny isn't someone you want to cross." With that, Raymond turned and walked away, his figure gradually blending into the shadows, leaving Lewis with Raymond's chilling words echoing in his mind. Lewis knew that Raymond's warning wasn't idle talk. Manny had the power to ruin the lives of anyone who dared to oppose him. But Lewis also knew he couldn't stop now. Back at the station, Lewis found Tessa waiting for him, her face marked with worry. "Chief, I found some documents on Charles's case. There's a testimony that wasn't included in the official file. It suggests that Charles was coerced into confessing, but someone seems to have hidden it." Lewis took the document, his eyes scanning the lines quickly. This was the evidence he'd been searching for, a trace of deceit and injustice that Charles had suffered. "You did well, Tessa," he said, unable to hide his gratitude. "I know this wasn't easy, but I won't let them continue to cover up the truth." Tessa gave a slight smile, though her eyes still showed concern. "Chief, I just worry that we're going too far. Manny isn't someone who plays nice, he can do anything to keep people silent." Lewis sighed, his shoulders heavy with the burden. "I know, Tessa. But if we don't do this, who will? If justice is just a facade, then what is our purpose?" The small cafe at the end of Pine Street was now closed, its lights dimming as darkness covered every corner of the street. But within Lewis's heart, a fire had begun to burn, even though he knew the road ahead was full of danger. And that night, as usual, Rosa sat on the park bench, her gaze fixed into the endless void, waiting for something that only she could see. That night, the rain poured down as if it wanted to wash the entire town of Ridgewood away. Lewis sat in his office, a stack of documents Tessa had uncovered spread out in front of him. The old, faded pages with their worn edges held conflicting testimonies, missing details, and cryptic notes. He had no doubt now, someone had deliberately hidden the truth about Charles's case. The office door suddenly swung open, and Tessa stepped in, holding a brown envelope. "Chief, I just received this." "The messenger said it was urgent," she said, handing the envelope to Lewis. Lewis tore it open, finding a handwritten letter inside with short, chilling words. "Stop before it's too late. Don't endanger your family over someone who's already been forgotten." His heart tightened. It was clearly a threat, likely from one of Manny's associates. "They're threatening me, Tessa," Lewis said, his voice calm but tense. "And I don't think they'll stop at just words." Tessa stood still for a moment, then stepped closer, looking him straight in the eyes. "Chief, if we back down now, everything Mrs. Rosa has endured for the past 20 years will be for nothing. If something's wrong, we have to bring it to light. I don't want to give up." Lewis smiled slightly, sensing Tessa's determination. "Good, because neither do I," he replied. "And I think it's time we push harder. Manny can't keep thinking he controls this town forever." The next day, Lewis decided to confront Manny directly. He knew it was a bold move, but if he wanted to uncover the truth, he couldn't avoid it any longer. Manny's bar was at the end of the street, where the light was never quite bright enough and laughter seemed to mask secret exchanges. Lewis entered the bar, his eyes sweeping over familiar faces, the men in black leather jackets who avoided eye contact. In the corner, Manny was lounging on a large armchair, a half-smoked cigar in hand, his eyes gleaming as he saw Lewis approaching. "Well, Lewis. I didn't expect you to come here," Manny said, his voice soft but carrying an undercurrent of menace. "Sit down. Let's talk." Lewis pulled up a chair across from him, showing no hesitation. "I'm not here to talk, Manny. I'm here to warn you. If you had any hand in covering up Charles's case, you'd better prepare to face the consequences." Manny chuckled, but it sounded like the hiss of a snake shedding its skin. "Do you really think you can do anything, Lewis? This is my town. I control everything here. The police, the government, even the justice you're so devoted to. And you think you can dismantle it all over a prisoner no one remembers?" Lewis's gaze remained steady, his voice sharp. "Justice isn't something that can be bought, Manny. Maybe you've forgotten that, but I haven't." Manny didn't respond immediately. He took a long drag from his cigar, exhaling the smoke slowly as he looked Lewis over like he was sizing up prey. "Then let's see who's more stubborn. Do you really think you can beat me?" Lewis stood, unwilling to waste any more words on him. "We'll find out soon enough." He turned and walked out of the bar, but he knew that from now on, things would only get harder. Manny wouldn't give up his power easily, and Lewis couldn't rely on a corrupt system to deliver justice. That night, the rain poured down heavily, but Rosa was still sitting on the park bench, as she did every night. She wore a thin raincoat, which barely protected her from the cold as the raindrops soaked her hair, running down her wrinkled face. Lucy came to her, holding an umbrella, trying to shield Rosa. "Grandma, why don't you go home and rest?" Lucy asked, her voice filled with worry. "It's freezing out here, you'll catch a cold." Rosa shook her head slightly, her gaze fixed far into the dark path. "Charles will come. He promised. I have to wait here, because this is where he'll find me." Lucy felt a lump in her throat. She knew Mrs. Rosa was holding on to a fragile hope, but she couldn't persuade her to let it go. "You know, I've heard people say that Manny threatened those who tried to help Charles. I'm afraid, this will never end." Rosa turned to look at Lucy, her eyes no longer as bright as before, but still holding a faint, flickering flame. "When Charles returns, everything will change. The truth will come to light, and no one can hide it forever. No matter how hard Manny tries, the truth will prevail." Meanwhile, Lewis sat alone in his office, the neon light from outside casting shifting shadows on the walls. He held the threatening envelope, quietly rereading each line. He knew Manny wasn't just a crime boss, he was someone who could destroy anyone who dared to stand against him. "No one will stop me," Lewis whispered, as if reminding himself. "Charles will be vindicated. Even if I have to face Manny and everyone behind him, I won't back down." The night grew darker, as if it wanted to swallow everything whole. But amidst the biting cold, Rosa continued to wait, and Lewis kept fighting. They were like two small, solitary lights, determined to pierce through the darkness engulfing Ridgewood. Somewhere, a storm was brewing, and secrets were about to be revealed. Lewis drove home through the dark night, his mind racing with thoughts of his confrontation with Manny. He knew he had crossed a line no one wanted to cross, but he had no intention of stopping. As he turned onto an empty road, the headlights illuminating the way, suddenly a large truck sped up from behind and slammed into the back of his car. Startled, Lewis gripped the steering wheel to keep control, but the truck rammed into him again, harder this time, forcing his car off the road and into a grassy area. Before he could react, the truck pulled ahead, blocking the road and preventing him from moving forward. A man stepped out of the truck, his face obscured in the darkness, but his tall frame and determined movements made his presence intimidating. He slowly approached Lewis's car and tapped on the window. "Step out and talk, Chief," he said, his voice dry but unmistakably clear. Lewis opened the car door and got out, staring directly at the man in front of him. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man smirked. "Just here to remind you that sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. You wouldn't want your family to get caught up in this, would you?" Lewis felt a chill run down his spine. "Did Manny send you?" he asked, his voice steady. The man didn't answer, only smirking. "I'm not the one asking questions here. But just so you know, this is your last warning. Keep digging into Charles's case, and you'll pay a steep price." Lewis looked directly into the man's cold, empty eyes, seeing nothing but indifference. "If you're trying to intimidate me, you've failed. I'm not so easily shaken." The man simply sneered. "We'll see if you still say that when your family's safety is at stake." He turned and walked back to the truck, but before he left, he threw out one last remark. "You can either protect them or let them suffer the consequences on your behalf." Lewis stood there, watching the truck disappear into the night, his heart filled with both anger and worry. Manny had taken a step further, threatening his family. But it also confirmed that he was on the right track. Men like Manny only resorted to violence and threats when they felt threatened. Lewis knew he had to continue, but he also didn't want his family caught in the crossfire. The next morning, Tessa arrived at the office early, finding Louis at his desk with dark circles under his eyes from a sleepless night. "Chief, what's going on? You don't look well," she asked, her voice full of concern. Louis recounted the events of the previous night, his tone low and serious. "We don't have much time, Tessa. Manny knows we're digging too deep, and he won't stop here. We have to uncover the truth before things get worse." Tessa looked at her boss, sensing the determination in his eyes but also seeing the danger lurking around them. "So what do we do, Chief? Manny isn't just bluffing, he really wants to stop us." Louis sighed and then said, "I need you to find a way to safeguard the evidence we have. We can't let it fall into the wrong hands. And I may need to bring in a few people from outside, those who aren't under Manny's control." That afternoon, Louis met George at the cafe at the end of Pine Street. George was sitting in a secluded corner, clutching a cup of hot coffee, a hint of fear in his eyes as he saw Louis enter. "I heard about last night," George said softly. "Manny warned you, didn't he?" Louis nodded and sat down across from George. "But I can't give up. I need to know more about Manny. If there's anything you haven't told me, now's the time to say it." George hesitated, but finally spoke, his voice so quiet it was only audible to Louis. "Manny doesn't just control the police and the government. He's also tied to a major smuggling network. Charles stumbled upon one of his deals, and that's the real reason he was arrested." Louis was stunned, feeling as if all the pieces were finally coming together. So Charles was framed to cover up Manny's illegal operations? "Exactly," George replied, his eyes gleaming with fear. "Charles was a threat because he knew too much. They thought silencing him would keep everything hidden. But I don't think Manny anticipated that Rosa wouldn't give up, or that you'd be digging into this case now." Louis clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger course through him. "George, if I keep investigating, Manny won't leave me alone. But I can't just stand by and watch a man's life be destroyed without doing something." George let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know who you're up against, Louis. Manny can erase any evidence, and he'll do whatever it takes to protect his power. But if you're determined, I'll help." Louis looked at George, a glimmer of hope appearing amidst the dark threats. "Thank you, George. I need all the help I can get." That evening, Louis drove home, his heart heavy. As soon as he walked through the door, the phone rang. He picked it up, and a cold, unfamiliar voice spoke on the other end. "Chief, listen carefully. Tonight, you have two choices: stop right now or accept that your loved ones won't be safe." Louis felt his heart pounding. "Who is this? Who are you?" The voice continued, emotionless. "Don't ask questions. Just remember that Manny doesn't play games. Stop, or you'll regret it." Louis gripped the phone tightly, his voice unwavering. "I'm not afraid of you. And I won't stop until the truth comes out." The line went dead, leaving an eerie silence. Louis stood there, full of determination but also worried about what lay ahead. He knew this fight wouldn't be easy, and his opponents were willing to do anything to keep their secrets. But no matter how thick the darkness, he would find a way to bring it to light. That was his promise to Rosa, and now his promise to the truth itself. After countless challenges and dangers, the day finally arrived. On the morning of the retrial for Charles, Ridgewood Central Courthouse was more crowded than usual. The seats were packed with journalists, curious townsfolk, and many of Charles's family members who had arrived early. Louis stood before the court, feeling the eyes of everyone on him. He knew this was the most critical moment after all they had been through. Rosa sat in the front row, her eyes red but shining with hope. She clutched Lucy's hand tightly, who sat beside her, offering comfort. "Do you think everything will be all right, Lucy?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly would shatter her fragile hope. "Don't worry, Mrs. Rosa," Lucy replied with a firm voice. "Louis has done everything he can to bring the truth to light. We have to trust in justice. The courtroom doors opened, and everyone turned to see Charles enter, dressed in gray prison clothes, his hands shackled but his head held high. He had lost weight, his face was gaunt, but he still held a look of determination. When his eyes met Rosa's, a weary smile appeared on his lips. Rosa broke into tears, the emotions spilling over as she finally saw the son she had waited for over the past 20 years. Louis approached Charles, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Charles, today will be the day everything changes. I promise you." Charles nodded slightly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you, Louis. Whatever happens, I'm grateful you didn't give up." In the tense silence, the trial began. The judge entered, striking the gavel firmly, as if to announce that today would be the day the truth came to light. On the prosecutor's side was Alex, a well-known and relentless attorney. He began with a cold, authoritative tone. "Your Honor, we believe that this case was thoroughly investigated 20 years ago, and that the original evidence is sufficient to uphold the sentence against the defendant, Charles." Sitting across from him was Charles's attorney, Emilio, a young woman with sharp eyes and unwavering resolve. Emilio had been brought onto the legal team by Louis after he realized they needed someone fierce enough to stand up to the powers backing Manny. Emilio stood up, her voice steady as she spoke. "Your Honor, we have gathered new evidence proving that Charles was wrongfully accused. The testimonies in the original case were coerced, and more importantly, there was interference from powerful individuals who deliberately pushed Charles into prison." Alex smirked, dismissively. "New evidence? Perhaps just some trivial rumors or hearsay from unreliable sources." Emilio looked directly at Alex, her eyes flashing with determination. "Then let us present what we have uncovered. And if it's the truth, you won't be able to deny it." The first few days of the trial passed, with Emilio presenting critical evidence, including the documents Tessa and Louis had found earlier, proving that Charles's testimony had been forced and was inconsistent. Emilio also called George as a witness, who had worked tirelessly to reveal the truth about Manny's connection to Charles's case. George took the stand, his voice trembling but filled with resolve. "I stayed silent for too long, and that silence helped put Charles in prison. But now, I want to tell the truth. Manny manipulated the police, threatened witnesses, and twisted this case from the very start." Alex retorted, his voice dripping with contempt. "Mr. George, do you have any evidence to support these claims? Or are you just weaving a story to cover up?" George didn't waver. He held up a file Emilio had prepared. "These are records of officers who accepted bribes from Manny's people to alter testimonies and hide damaging information. This isn't just hearsay, it's the truth." The courtroom buzzed with shock. Alex tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear he had been put on the defensive. Manny hadn't appeared at the trial, but Louis knew he was surely keeping a close eye on every development. During a recess, Louis met with Charles in the hallway. Charles looked around, searching for reassurance among the strangers. "Louis, I never thought this would actually happen. I had lost all hope." Louis placed a comforting hand on Charles's shoulder, his voice gentle. "Charles, I understand. But your mother, Mrs. Rosa, never gave up. She believed that one day you would come back, and today, we're trying to make that a reality." A tear slid down Charles's cheek, and he turned his face away to hide it. "I don't know how I'll ever repay everyone. All I want is to be free, to go home." Emilio stepped up, her face tense but shining with determination. "Charles, we're not done yet. There's still a lot to fight for in this trial, but I believe that justice is finally emerging. We're going to see this through to the end." That afternoon, the trial resumed with Tessa taking the stand. She testified about the deception she had uncovered in the investigation from 20 years ago. Tessa not only pointed out the errors but also bravely criticized the corruption within the police force, causing the courtroom to fall into a stunned silence. "Your Honor," Tessa said, her voice unwavering. This is not just about one person wrongly accused. This is a system that was exploited, turning an innocent man into a criminal. And I am here to correct that wrong. Alex tried to counter her testimony, but Emilio swiftly rebutted. They may try to bury the truth, but they cannot keep it hidden forever. We have evidence, we have witnesses, and we won't stop until justice is restored for Charles. Rosa sat quietly in the courtroom, her face marked by lines of pain and endurance, yet her eyes sparkled with hope. She clutched Lucy's hand tightly, feeling a weight finally lifting from her heart. She had waited 20 years to see her son given a chance, and she wouldn't let it slip away. The trial finally reached its conclusion. The courtroom was silent, tense with anticipation, as the judge held the verdict in his hands, his eyes sweeping over the people before him. After days of debate, cross-examinations, and re-evaluation of evidence, everything now hinged on his decision. After a thorough review of new evidence and testimony from witnesses, the judge began, his voice grave yet compassionate. The court finds the defendant, Charles Martinez, not guilty. A collective gasp rose throughout the courtroom, followed by applause from the back rows. Rosa burst into tears, the lines of her aged face softened by joy. She covered her face, seemingly unable to believe what she was hearing. Lucy hugged her tightly, her own eyes filled with tears. "Grandma, Charles is innocent. He's coming home." Charles stood motionless in the center of the courtroom, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. His eyes filled with tears, his lips trembling. For 20 years, he had thought he'd never have this moment, that he would forever remain buried in the darkness of injustice. But now, he was free. Emilio beamed with pride as she glanced over at Alex, who stood speechless, unsure of how to react. "I told you, justice never stays silent forever," she said, her tone calm yet brimming with satisfaction. Louis, standing by the door, watched Charles with a profound sense of relief and joy. He had fought tirelessly, overcoming all obstacles to reach this moment. When their eyes met, Louis gave Charles a small nod, as if to say that it was finally over, and he was free. A week later, Charles stood at the gates of the prison where he had been confined for 2 decades. The sky was clear that day, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees as warm sunlight bathed the surroundings. But to Charles, everything felt new. He took a deep breath, listening to the distant birdsong, savoring the scent of freedom in the air. The prison gates swung open, and Charles took his first steps outside, his steps tentative, as if he were stepping into a world he didn't belong to. He had spent 20 years within cold, gray walls, and now he had to learn to live again, to start from scratch. He looked around, his eyes landing on a familiar figure waiting by the gate. Louis stood there, holding his police hat, a warm smile spreading across his face as he watched Charles approach. "Hello, Charles," he said, his voice soft yet filled with warmth. "Welcome back." Charles looked at Louis, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Louis, you really came to meet me?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. Louis nodded, stepping closer and patting Charles on the shoulder. "I promised, didn't I? I wasn't going to let you walk out of here alone." Charles smiled, but tears also rolled down his cheeks. I don't know what to say, Louis. Thank you for not giving up, for believing in me when no one else did. You've given me this life, all over again." Louis looked at Charles, feeling a lump in his throat. "You don't need to thank me, Charles. You deserved freedom. You and your mother have endured enough. Now, you can start over, live the life you've always wanted." Charles lowered his head, taking a deep breath, letting the air of freedom fill his lungs. 20 years, Louis. I waited for this moment for 20 years. There were times I wanted to give up, thinking I'd never walk out of there. But I was wrong, and it's all because of you and everyone who helped me. Louis placed a hand on Charles's shoulder, his eyes filled with seriousness. "You weren't wrong, Charles. What was wrong was the system that made you suffer. But now it's been corrected. We won. They walked together down the path leading away from the prison, a road lined with green trees. Charles felt as if he were stepping into a new world, one where he could finally leave painful memories behind. They stopped at a small cafe near the prison, where Louis had planned for Charles to enjoy a real cup of coffee after all these years. As they walked in, the cafe owner recognized Charles and greeted him with a gentle smile. "Welcome back, Charles. I heard you were set free. This coffee's on the house, for a free man." Charles took the cup, feeling the warmth radiate through his hands, as if it were melting away the chill that had settled in his heart for so long. He breathed in the aroma, feeling as if he were truly living for the first time. "Thank you," he said, but it was meant not just for the cafe owner, but for everyone who had helped him reach this day. Louis sat across from Charles, and they shared a silent moment, the quiet filled with meaning. "So, what will you do next, Charles?" Louis asked, his voice gentle. Charles looked down at his coffee, then out the window, where golden sunlight streamed in. "I'm going home, to see my mother," he said, his eyes lighting up as he mentioned Rosa. "She waited for me for 20 years. Now it's time to go home and tell her it's over, that I'm back." Louis smiled, his chest filled with joy. "Good, because Mrs. Rosa is definitely waiting for you. She told me she wouldn't stop waiting until she saw you come home. And now, she has a reason to smile." Charles felt warmth in his heart, as if a weight had finally been lifted. "I'll never forget this, Louis. Thank you for giving me a chance to start over." "That's something we all deserve, Charles, a chance to live, to love, and to start again," Louis replied, his eyes shining. "And I know you'll make the most of it because you've endured enough to appreciate it." They sat there, amid the quiet murmur of the cafe, sunlight illuminating faces that had been through so much. Life could be cruel, but sometimes, it knew how to return what was deserved. Charles had lost 20 years, but he had regained his freedom, his faith, and a chance to live once more. Charles walked into Ridgewood Park, where he knew his mother would be. The sky was bright and blue, gentle sunlight streaming through the leaves, yellow ones drifting gently down the path. His heart raced, filled with both joy and anticipation. He had imagined this moment thousands of times, but now, as it was happening, it all felt like a dream. From a distance, Charles saw the small figure of Rosa sitting on the old bench, where she had waited every day for 20 long years. Her silver hair fluttered in the wind, and her frail hands clutched the worn scarf she never let go of. Charles slowed his steps, afraid that if he walked too quickly, this dream would vanish. "Mother," he called softly, his voice choked but brimming with emotion. Rosa startled and looked up, her eyes widening as she saw the figure standing before her. For a moment, she could hardly believe her eyes. "Charles," she whispered, as if speaking louder would make the image before her dissolve like morning mist. Charles stepped forward, saying nothing more, and knelt at her feet, wrapping his arms around her legs. "Mother, it's me. I'm home," he said, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. Rosa embraced her son, her own tears flowing freely, though they were tears of joy and relief after 2 long decades. "Charles, you're really back. I knew it. I always believed you'd return," she said, her voice trembling but filled with conviction. They held each other tightly in the park, which had borne witness to so much pain and waiting. Now, the moment was replaced with joy and happiness. Passers-by stopped, recognizing Charles, the man who had finally been exonerated after 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment. A short while later, familiar faces began to gather. Lucy was the first to arrive, her eyes glistening as she took in the heartwarming sight before her. "Charles, you're really back. I can hardly believe this has become reality," she said, her voice trembling. Charles stood and turned to Lucy, his eyes filled with profound gratitude. "Lucy, I know you stayed by my mother's side all this time, caring for and supporting her. I can never thank you enough. You've become part of our family." Lucy smiled, though her tears continued to fall. "I only did what I thought was right." Mrs. Rosa never lost hope, and neither did I. "Now that you're here, I feel incredibly lucky to witness this moment." Soon after, Louis appeared, standing back for a moment, looking at Charles and Rosa with a warm smile. "Charles, I think I've seen enough of life's wonders for a lifetime," he said, his voice gentle yet unable to hide his emotion. "Welcome back." Charles stepped forward and embraced Louis tightly. Louis patted Charles's back, his own eyes glistening. "Seeing you and your mother reunited, I know it was all worth it." Shortly after, George appeared, his frame bent and his old hat in hand. He stood watching the reunion with a tender yet remorseful look. "Charles, I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. You never should have had to endure that," he said softly. Charles turned to George, his eyes shining with understanding and forgiveness. "George, I don't blame you. You were brave enough to tell the truth, and that's all I needed. Without you, we wouldn't be here today." George nodded, his own eyes brimming with tears. "You're a strong man, Charles. I hope your life is now filled with light and happiness." Rosa stood, her eyes brighter than they had ever been, and spoke to everyone around her. "I don't know how to thank you all. For 20 years, I lived in the shadow of sorrow, but I never stopped believing that my son would come home. All of you helped me hold on to that hope, and now we can share this joy together." Lucy stepped forward, taking Rosa's hand, her eyes red yet smiling. "Mrs. Rosa, you deserve to see this day. Your patience and love for Charles inspired all of us." Rosa smiled, her gaze lingering on each person, as if she wanted to imprint their faces on her memory. "Love never gives up, does it? And today, we've proven that." Charles looked back at his mother, then at all those who had helped him, his heart overwhelmed. "Mother, and everyone, thank you for not giving up on me. I don't know how I'll ever repay you all, but I will live a life worthy of the faith you all had in me." Louis chuckled, giving Charles's shoulder a reassuring pat. "There's no need to repay anything, Charles. Just be happy, that's the greatest gift you could give us all." As the sun began to set, its golden light filtered through the leaves, creating a beautiful scene. Laughter, gratitude, and tears of happiness filled the peaceful space of Ridgewood Park. This place had once witnessed a mother's endless waiting, and now it stood as a witness to reunion, to love, and to perseverance triumphing over all. Charles and Rosa's story was not only a journey of reclaiming justice but also a reminder of the strength of truth, patience, and unconditional love. For 20 years, Rosa sat on that park bench, never once giving up hope. Her love and resolve had been the guiding light in the battle for Charles's freedom. Charles had lost 2 decades of his life, locked away for a crime he did not commit. His life had been stolen, but he never lost his faith in the truth. When he was finally freed, he reclaimed not only his personal freedom but also became a symbol of justice restored, proving that wrongs and injustices could not stand forever. Charles's release from prison opened doors that had long been shut, revealing the dark forces that had controlled Ridgewood for years. Manny, the mastermind behind every cruel plot, believed he could keep the truth buried with his power and manipulation, but he was wrong. The truth could not be concealed indefinitely, and once revealed, it would sweep away all falsehood. With Charles's exoneration, an investigation into Manny began. The secrets he had hidden for 2 decades were brought to light. Manny's manipulation wasn't limited to Charles's case, he had built a network of power through bribery, threats, and illegal activities. But the exposure of his crimes began with the truth about Charles. The court reopened the investigation into Manny, not only for what he had done to Charles but for the other crimes he had committed. Former allies, once afraid or bought off, now turned against him, willing to testify to save themselves. Manny was arrested, with no chance of escape. The sight of him being handcuffed and led away from his luxurious office became a symbol of the downfall of his criminal empire. Ultimately, Manny was convicted of numerous charges, from bribery and manipulation to severe criminal offenses. He was sent to prison, where he would face the isolation and consequences of the atrocities he had committed. He had believed power would protect him forever, but he was wrong. Power without justice is merely a facade, and that facade could not withstand the truth. This story is not just about the downfall of a villain, but also about those who dared to stand up, to face danger for what was right. Louis, Tessa, Emilio, George, and the others, they could have chosen to back down, but they didn't. They chose justice, they chose truth, and because of that, they changed the fate of one man and the entire town of Ridgewood. Justice never comes easily, Louis had once said. But if we don't give up, justice will come even if it's delayed. His words became a guiding principle throughout this arduous journey. When the people of Ridgewood saw the truth revealed, they not only witnessed the fall of a villain but also the triumph of human values, honesty, and courage. From Charles and Rosa's story, a profound message spread, that love, patience, and truth can overcome any obstacle. Rosa had waited 20 years for her son, not because she had any guarantee of his release but because she believed in truth and her love. That faith became the flame lighting the path for everyone else. When Charles was freed, he became a symbol of hope and resilience. He had survived injustice and 2 decades of confinement, and when he walked out, he carried not bitterness but gratitude for those who fought for the truth. "I once thought I'd remain buried in darkness forever," he said. "But thanks to my mother and those who never stopped believing in justice, I found the light again." This story also shows the power of solidarity. Manny may have been powerful, but he couldn't hide the truth alone without accomplices. Conversely, without the support and unity of good people, Charles might never have regained his freedom. Each person contributed to exposing the truth, from George, who bravely revealed what he knew, to Tessa, who fiercely investigated and safeguarded crucial evidence. Charles and his supporters' victory was not just a personal one but a triumph of the noble values that society holds dear. It reminds us that, even in the face of injustice and abuse of power, there will always be people willing to stand up for the truth. Those individuals may face consequences, may confront dangers, but they are fearless because they know that truth and justice will ultimately prevail. At the story's end, the town of Ridgewood was no longer a place where dark forces could easily manipulate. Charles and Rosa's story inspired people and reignited faith in truth and justice. And for Charles, his new life was more than just freedom, it was the start of a new journey where each day would be filled with gratitude and appreciation. Their story proved that, no matter how long the wait, truth and justice will always prevail. Villains may win temporarily, but they will never triumph indefinitely. This is the deepest lesson that this story imparts, a lesson not only for the people of Ridgewood but for all of us.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.